So the question from Robert is, what did freedom from addiction or recovery look like before this ministry started? Did it exist? What's the history of recovery from sexual addiction? I think this is a very interesting question.
I mean, I know of SA, I know of Cliff and Joyce Pinner. There's some people that have been doing this for a good 50 years. So I know that. Now, before that, they may not have called it sexual addiction, right? Because it's evolved over time. Even since we've been a part of, or I guess since Pure Desire started, and then we have, it just keeps evolving as far as what people know, how we understand the brain, and addiction and recovery. We learn from people's experiences. And I really think, too, years ago, it wasn't talked about. So it was there, but it wasn't talked about as much as hopefully as it is now, so that it's more exposed. But it's definitely been around a while. I would say, just for my first thought when I was thinking about what did people do before they knew about sexual addiction, or there were ministries like Pure Desire, people had the resources they had and they did the best with what they had. So I think if the opposite of addiction is intimacy or connection, then people found a way to be intimate or to connect. They had new opposite experiences, new ways of seeing things and practicing and walking them out. So that's what I would say, because we know that sexual behavior, sexual acting out's been gone on for all of history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
I think about that in the late 70s or the 80s, mid 80s, that Dr. Patrick Carnes is kind of given credit for coining the phrase sexual addiction and making it more a public conversation that, hey, this is a real thing. People get caught up in behaviors, that it becomes a brain issue. And then that started to coincide, I think, in the 90s and even 2000s, where we started to learn a lot more about the brain, and that those same processes of the chemical release and the high, and followed by then the lows, and then tolerance and the need for escalation for more and more, just like what was happening in drug addiction and alcohol addiction was happening to people in their sexuality. So there was some learning that took place there. And I think prior to that, from what I would understand, one thing to keep in mind is when we're going back prior to the 90s, you're talking about a real change in how people would have accessed pornographic material and sexual addiction, that they had to go somewhere, they had to buy something, they had to go to a strip club, call a 1-900 number. It often took time, money, and effort in ways that we don't see now to that same degree. So by the time someone was willing to face their behavior as potentially, in a sexual addiction, even if they didn't call it that, it was more the extreme cases. And I think, particularly in Christian circles, a lifestyle of avoidance, of just learning to be wise about where I went and who I associated with, was overall much more successful because there just weren't as many places to easily and readily access pornography. And that's one of the things we've talked about. The game changed in the mid to late 90s when home internet became the norm. And then again, when the smartphone became the norm in 2010, 2011, the game truly changed because what once people had to go and do publicly now was at their fingertips in the privacy of any place they were with access to the internet. And it really is, I've told people, like, we're living in the world's greatest social experiment that we've ever seen. And I think we're going to look back and realize that we got flooded by images and a culture of pornography that we were not ready to handle. And we're going to see long-term the damaging effects on our society. And so to say it that way, what people did before, well, I think you could be more successful to preach the word of God, to be honest with your brothers if you're struggling with lust, to get prayed for, and then just make sure you didn't go to that video store or walk by that part of town. And it wasn't the same as carrying that access everywhere you go. And I just think when I think of that history, it ought to raise the level in us of our desire to respond and to do something different, that we aren't just relying on avoidance anymore. We're not just relying on, well, make a few smart choices and you can be free of this. We're dealing with a whole new ballgame. And so I think in some ways, like we've talked about it at Pure Desire, that I believe God brought this ministry into existence along with several others. It's amazing if you look at the timeline, how many sexual addiction recovery ministries were birthed in the 2000s, because I think God was raising them up for such a time as this, for such a time as where our world would be inundated with this battle, that there would be people ready to respond. And so I would just end with that for you, Robert. I think in some ways we are facing a social predicament that no other generation had to face Now, certainly sexual desire and
Yeah.
lust and acting out is not new, but the context in which it's happening for us is at a level of intensity and availability that no one has seen before.
Mhm.
And so we're needing to develop new systems of how do we respond, and how do we respond broadly as churches and communities and families, so that we can help people learn to be resilient to the porn that is now all around them.
The only two things I'd add were just therapy was something that's existed for a long time, clinical care in that sense, and then also trauma work. I know that the research has really expanded our understanding of trauma and how to help with it today. But yeah, trauma work also. Those are two things that I think existed before Pure Desire.